Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you here today. And today I want to talk about a little bit about being on the path, right? Some of us have been on the path, so to speak, for a long time, years, maybe decades. Others of us might be just starting on the path and finding our way and finding our way to the path. So what I want to talk about today is what it means to wake up. Like, what is it like to wake up? And I'm going to do a little bit of reading from this book, Wake Up to Your Life by Ken MacLeod. And I was actually introduced to this book by a teacher of mine named Isa Gadarchi. I work and studying with her Buddhist psychology right now. So this really comes from that, and it starts with the story of Buddha, with Siddhartha, right? Because we can learn a lot from his story and his life and apply that to our own lives. And so I'm just going to go ahead and read through this a bit and pause, give some inquiry, so that we can begin to use his life as an example of how we can live our lives as well. So again, this is from the book Wake Up to Your Life by Ken MacLeod. And he says, approximately 2,500 years ago, Siddhartha, a prince of the Shakya clan of northern India, abandoned his royal heritage to seek the source of human suffering. Sheltered by an overly protective father who wanted his son to succeed to the throne, Siddhartha grew up in the greatest luxury that his time could provide. Not until his 20s did the prince venture beyond the palace grounds. His illusions about life were quickly shattered as he encountered illness, old age, and death among his subjects. Soon afterwards, Siddhartha saw an old religious mendicant who was utterly present and at peace. How could that be, he thought? How could anyone be at peace in the midst of all that suffering? So he goes on to say, we first encounter the mystery of being when our view of life is called into question, right? So in this example, in Buddha's life, all he had known his entire life up until the time that he left the walls of the palace was pure luxury. His father had protected him from everything, made sure that he didn't see any pain or suffering. And then one day he left those walls of the palace and that protection, and he saw something quite different and quite disturbing to him. And just like Siddhartha, when we first encounter this mystery of being, our life is called into question, right? So all too often, this is back to the reading here, all too often we react by ignoring, closing down, manipulating, or controlling what arises in experience to avoid questioning that view of life and what we feel we are. So we get to this point in our life when we're on the path of shutting down and not wanting to question anything, just sort of wanting to push away from it, not look at it, even though we know we need to. So he goes on to say, Siddhartha could not ignore what he had seen. Power, wealth, and position became meaningless to him in the face of illness, old age, and death. His conceptions of life and what he was were turned upside down and inside out. How many of us have experienced that before, where our conceptions of who we are have been turned upside down and inside out? If you've ever gone through any type of big life transition, whether it was a death of a beloved or a divorce or the change of a career, it puts ourselves and our identity into question, right? So he goes on to say, for Siddhartha, his conceptions of life and what he thought were turned upside down and inside out. He saw another possibility, however, in the presence and peace of the religious mendicant, the fellow that he saw sitting in peace. The first encounter with mystery of being momentarily the encounter with the mystery of being momentarily shatters the structures of ordinary life. When everything falls away, a moment of opening takes place. And in that moment, we are free. Free from the fetters of beliefs and ideas about who and what we are and who we should be. In other words, in the midst of the destruction of our illusions about life, we experience being what we really are, free, open, awareness. Most of the time, however, we don't notice that freedom and open awareness. We're too busy putting our view of life back together. Even if we do notice it, we don't stay there for long. But like Siddhartha, we have encountered the religious mendicant and the possibility of presence. Siddhartha soon left the court life. He left the court life, and he knew that he had to examine the issue of suffering. Why is there suffering? Where does it come from? Like, this was Buddha's greatest gift to humanity, was his understanding of suffering and how we can deal with it. His first step was to turn to the religious teachers of the day. And he quickly learned everything that they had to teach, their philosophies, their meditation techniques, and the codes of conduct. He practiced what he was taught, and he gained abilities equal to those of his teachers, yet his questions remained unanswered. The mystery of being often makes itself felt in our lives in the form of questions. We turn to institutions, traditions, and respected teachers, hoping to find answers to our questions. We study and practice, and learning much that is helpful. When we really listen to our own questions, however, we know that we can never receive answers to them from an instruction or an institution, a tradition, or another person. The answer can only come through our own experience. At some point, we take what we have learned and apply it to our own questions. We have to make the practice our own. And I think that this is critical, because when we're on the path, when we're seekers, we look here and we look there, and we find a little piece of information here and we take it, and we find a little piece of information there and we take it. And what he's saying here is so true, which is that you can get the clues, you can get some of the information, some of the practices, the techniques from other people. And we do need that. We need teachers along the way. We have to have teachers, because we have to have someone who's been there that can show us the way. However, in the end, it all comes back to our own inner experience. You have to have gnosis. Gnosis means the lived, the felt experience. And gnosis, knowledge, is beyond intellect. So you can be the smartest philosopher in the world. You can know all the books inside and out, and you can be a great theologian or spiritual, someone who knows all the spiritual scriptures. But that intellect means absolutely nothing when it comes to the spiritual path. It's about gnosis. It's about the inner knowing. I am recalling right now a story that has been told by one of Yogananda's, Paramahansa Yogananda, who I'm a disciple of that lineage, one of his primary disciples told a story that I'm remembering, how at the time when Yogananda was still alive, there were a group of disciples gathered around him, and this particular disciple was a very, very simple man, not someone you would call intelligent at all, not smart necessarily. And Yogananda, the fellow walked away, that disciple walked away, and Yogananda told the rest of the disciples, he's almost there, meaning that he has almost attained enlightenment. And some of the disciples said, but Master, how can he be almost there? He's so simple. I mean, he doesn't really even know anything. And Master Yogananda smiled and said, that's where you're mistaken. Simplicity is the way to God, is the way to knowing. In other words, you don't need to be an intellect. You don't need to have philosophical training and be able to espouse all of these things and be a great debater in order to know, in order to have the experience of being on the path and knowing God. So that's a key critical piece of information. So as we move along here in the reading, he says, along with 5 companions, Siddhartha, who we know now as Buddha, began a life of extreme asceticism in order to understand the source of human suffering. Tradition, in fact, records that for 6 years, Siddhartha ingested only 1 sesame seed, 1 grain of rice, and 1 drop of water each day. Pretty extreme. So what he goes on to say is, when we discover that our approach to life is based on an illusion, many people react by pursuing wealth and power. In pursuing asceticism, Siddhartha was taking an approach to life that was the opposite of the one that most people adopt. And we can understand that. We can get that because he came from a life of opulence. He came from a life of luxury. So he swung the pendulum all the way to the opposite side and did the exact opposite thing, right? Was very minimalist. He learned, though, that wealth and power were meaningless because of his earlier life. Perhaps the answers to his questions could be found in poverty and austerity. But whether we pursue wealth or austerity, our lives are still based on the same conditioning. We're running in one direction or another. So think for yourself. Many times those of us who are on the path will do that same type of pendulum swing. Will swing to the exact opposite side. I can think of myself, for instance, when I was back in my 30s, early 30s, and I divorced my husband. I had a young daughter at the time, and I've mentioned this before. I was a hardcore triathlete. That was my identity. I was a personal trainer. I like to call this my past life. I was a personal trainer, triathlete, coach. My identity was Lisa, the triathlete. And I was on the path, and I swung the pendulum to the exact opposite side. I quit triathlon. I quit racing, running. I quit coaching. I quit everything. And I just sort of entered into this whole other path. I thought that doing this outward thing of renouncing the way that I used to be would be the way to get there. However, as he's saying, doing this isn't going to make a difference because we're trying to change our outer conditions, not our inner conditions. It's our inner conditions that we have to change. So our lives, he says, when we do that, our lives are really still based on the same conditioning. We're just running in one direction or the other. Which direction the conditioning runs makes absolutely no difference. Like a train that's been going in the wrong direction, we stop turn around and go the opposite way, but we're still running on the same tracks. Can you identify a point in your life when you've done that, or maybe you're doing that right now? It's good to look and inquire and question about that. To enter the mystery of being, we have to step off of the tracks. He goes on returning to the story of Siddhartha. He says, after 6 years of starving himself, Siddhartha could no longer keep his mind clear. I mean, honestly, I don't think I could keep my mind clear after 6 days of starving myself. I mean, I've done some cleanses before where I've done 10 days of fasting, and that's been enough for me. But 6 years, wow. Okay, so all jest aside, he concluded that the practice of asceticism, like to stumble over that word, for its own sake would not lead him to understanding suffering. Siddhartha stopped his regimen and began to eat normally, despite being rejected by his companions. With his body restored, he sat under a tree and resolved not to move until he understood the source of suffering. He let his mind rest in attention, undistracted, not trying to make anything happen, not trying to cultivate any particular quality or ability. He stopped everything and simply sat with his question, what is the source of suffering? So how do we step off the tracks, right? How do we stop trying to avoid? How do we stop closing down? How do we stop manipulating or trying to control what arises in our experience? When we do stop, we're inevitably regarded with suspicion and even rejected by those who continue to live their lives based on patterns and conditioning. And so we often must go forward alone. Right? So that's a important piece there, that we need to stop avoiding. We need to stop trying to manipulate what is arising in our life. Stop trying to control it. So he goes on, that evening, Siddhartha entered progressively deeper states of attention. The traditional accounts describe how Mara, the demon of obsession, tried to distract Siddhartha by bringing him back to the realm of reaction and confusion where Mara held sway. He first tried to distract Siddhartha with desire by sending his daughters in the form of beautiful women to seduce him with affection, relationships, and sexual pleasure. Understanding that all experience, no matter how pleasurable, comes and goes, Siddhartha remained in attention. Mara then tried anger next, sending armies of demons to the attack. Siddhartha saw the demonic armies as the play of the mind, so the rain of weapons arose in his experience as a rain of beautiful flowers. Siddhartha then saw that the source of suffering was emotional reaction to what arises in experience. He saw that reactivity is based on the misperception that the I exists apart from experience. When he saw through the misperception, it dissolved completely. In that moment, Siddhartha became a Buddha, a person who has awakened from the deep sleep of unawareness and reactive repatterning. Mara had one final challenge for him and demanded an external validation of his experience. Buddha Shakyamuni smiled, touched the earth, and said, "The earth is my witness." And that was the end. So there's so much that we can learn from from Buddha's story here. And the author of this book, of Wake Up to Your Life, goes on and he sort of outlines these different steps, which I think is important when we're on the path. I've always found it helpful when I've been given signposts or I've been told, like, this is what you're going to experience when you're on the path. Otherwise, it's like, how do you know what you're experiencing if you're on the path, if you're not on the path? So it's always nice to have these signposts here. So first of all, we need to know that waking up is hard. Waking up is hard to do. Not breaking up, but waking up. So waking up is hard to do. It's not easy. And so often in the new age realm, there's an idea that it can be easy, but it's not. It's not easy. We first must realize that we're asleep, right? So that's number one. Waking up is hard to do. Number two, we need to identify what keeps us asleep and then start to take it apart. This is number three, right? Take it apart, keep working at dismantling it until it no longer functions. And one of the things that we can do in order to begin dismantling is to begin questioning our worldview, because often we'll do everything that we can to hold on to our beliefs and to hold on to our worldview. If you look at what's happening in the world today, anybody who just thinks about it for a moment and watches, whether you are Republican or Democrat in the United States and you're watching CNN or Fox News, it doesn't matter, right? Either way, they're so attached to their worldview, they can't let go of it, that we can't even begin to see each other. So one of the things that we need to begin to ask ourselves is, in what ways am I avoiding questioning my own worldview? What is my worldview? And is it true? Right? Where in my life am I ignoring things? Where in my life am I trying to control what arises in my experience? Where am I in my life trying to control what arises in my experience in order to avoid questioning my worldview, in order to avoid questioning my beliefs? These are the questions we have to ask ourselves, right? And we need to begin to look at and question that worldview and who I think I am, like, who do I think I am, and who do I feel that I am? And it's that inquiry that begins the process of this re-identification of ourselves, of discovering who we really are. So then this fourth point is, he goes on to say, as soon as we make an effort to wake up, we start opening up to how things really are. We experience that we have suppressed or avoided, we experience what we have suppressed or avoided and what we have ignored or overlooked. That's painful. It's very painful. And when that happens, of course, if you've been on the path for any amount of time, you know, when that happens, the reactive patterns that have run our lives, kept us in confusion, distorted our feelings, and caused us to ignore what is right or what is right in front of us, are triggered. How many of us can relate to that? When we make that decision, in the moment that you make the decision, I'm on this path, I'm on this journey, things start to arise in your life to just trigger you and make you feel like you're that much further away from the destination. And as we know, it's a journey and there is no destination, right? So those things arise, we're triggered, they rise up strongly to undermine the attention that is bringing us into deeper relationship with what we are, with who we are as well, and what we are experiencing. So number 6 on this path then is when we can see those patterns and everything that is constructed out of them as the movement of mind and nothing else, we begin to wake up. It's a practice, just like I was talking about the last time we met here, right? The final challenge posed by habituated patterns is to question direct experience. We need to question ourselves. How do I know? How do I know this is true? How do we know? How can we trust this knowing, which is totally beyond the ordinary conditioned experience of life? And how can we trust the knowing which is beyond intellect? You got to get that wisdom and knowing on the path is beyond intellect. You can't think about it. It's not going to happen in your mind. It's beyond the mind. So like Buddha Shakyamuni, we turn to no external reference and live in the knowing. We live in the presence, in the mystery itself. After his awakening, Buddha Shakyamuni spent the next 7 weeks quietly digesting what happened. His initial assessment was that no one could possibly understand what he had discovered. And eventually, however, the Buddha decided that he had a responsibility to try to communicate his understanding with others. He set off for Benares, a major city a few miles away. Right? So he knew that he needed to share his understanding with others, which again is another example. Buddha set the example for us, and although most of us will never, it's a long way to total enlightenment and Buddhahood for most of us. What we can take from this is the piece of giving back. When within ourselves, we have attained some level of knowing, of gnosis. Part of our service is to the greater unknown, to the divine love intelligence, to God, whatever you want to call it, is to give back, is to serve that divine love intelligence by giving that gnosis back to those who have not attained it yet. Right? When we see how things actually are, our whole system experiences a profound shock. We are not what we thought we are. All our struggles to define who and what we are revealed as pointless, fruitless, and self-defeating. At first, we have no idea or how to function, but we're still breathing. Life goes on, but now what? Our natural human impulse is to share our knowledge, our gnosis, and to give that understanding to others. And this impulse manifests in life as compassion, which is a response to the circumstances of the moment. And in ending this section and just sort of ending us off here, the author goes on to finish up Buddha's story. In the village of Sharnath, a suburb of Benares, Buddha encountered his companions in asceticism. There he goes, stumbling over that word. At first, they didn't want to have anything to do with him and resolved to ignore him. As Buddha approached, however, they felt an extraordinary presence and spontaneously rose to greet him. They were so awed by his presence that they asked him to explain what had happened. Buddha Shakyamuni started with the existence of suffering and explained what he now knew. For Buddha, the circumstance of the moment was this chance meeting with his former companions, and all of them had been motivated originally by the question of suffering. So now he gave his first teaching, the Four Noble Truths. So next time we meet, we will talk about those, the Four Noble Truths. So we're sort of start looking at the Four Noble Truths and how that applies to us. But for now, I invite you to take in this story of Buddha, the Buddha, and what it means for you and how you can reflect on your life and your walking this path, whether you're like me, someone who's been on the path for many, many years, or you're just beginning the path. It doesn't matter where you enter. We're all entering from this same place, essentially. So with that, I bow to you, namaste, and look forward to seeing you again next time.